Hello and welcome to today's video. My name's Tom Chaplin from Master the Light Photography Workshops and Tours, and today we're going to be taking this picture of a leopard from this to this just using Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. Okay, so let's get on with it. Through this video I'm going to talk through a good workflow system when you're working within Camera Raw. All of the changes we make today would apply to Lightroom. I just have worked with a client recently that particularly uses Camera Raw, so I thought I'd make something using this platform instead of my normal Lightroom videos. So the first thing I would suggest you do when you opened your image in Camera Raw is coming down here to the bottom where it gives you information about your file. Now I've already made a change here that yours probably won't have, and I recommend working with a bit depth of 16 bits. So changing your depth to 16 bits, and that just means that you're going to have a higher color bit depth. So you will have more colors inside of your color space to work on. And when you export to JPEG, the colors will be reduced back down, but you'll be working on a image that has more information in it, which is always useful when you're editing. And then the other thing just to check on is that you're working in Adobe RGB and that your resolution is at 300 ppi. And again, if you need to change this before you export, then we will, but it's good to work on a high resolution document. So that's the first thing I would just mention. Okay, so let's actually get down to the editing. So I'll go through the order I normally work in when editing a file in Lightroom or in Camera Raw, and I'll explain the reasoning as I go through. So the first thing I would suggest adjusting is your exposure. So we're just going to do that now. So I'm just going to pull this down slightly, just to about half a stop darker, just to pull some of the tone back and we get a little bit more information back in the picture. Always refer to your histogram when doing this. So if I'm going to follow the histogram, having it slightly darker makes a little bit more sense, just to pull the highlights off the end. It'll pull the brightness of this fur back as well, so we recover a bit of that information. So I think somewhere between half a stop and 3/4 of a stop is going to be about right. So we'll just drop it to there. The next thing I suggest you adjust is your white balance and your tint, and that's because all of the sliders in here all affect each other to some degree, and particularly the colors can affect the brightness and darkness values within your picture. So these being your tonal sliders will be affected by your white balance. So it's really good to have that set to start with. So I think that the image is slightly cold. I can see that there's some blue in the highlights of the picture, and that's usually an indicator that the image is slightly cold, unless you've got a lovely blue sky, in which case there should be blue in your highlights. But in this situation it's just ever so slightly cold, so I'm just going to pull that up a little bit, just to 6200. I think that's fine. Next we're going to use the tint slider. The image is slightly green. A really good way of knowing that is to pull your image up and down so that you really lose what the original color was like, and then you adjust it to the point where you can't see the green anymore and it's not too pink. So this is where the image started, and I think we're just going to go to about -3 or -2 just to pull a bit more of that green out of the picture, and that's probably a good place to start anyway. If we need to make any adjustments to these as we go, obviously we're working with a raw file, so you can do that at any point if you feel like you need to make an adjustment. The next thing we're going to change are our white and black points. Now these are the extremes of our histogram, so it's pulling the absolute darkest parts of our image to make them brighter or darker, and with whites you're pulling the brightest part of your images to be brighter and darker. So we're going to start with whites. Now a trick with this is to hold the Alt key whilst you do it, and as we do that you'll see that your image turns black. And as I drag this up, so I'm making the whites whiter, whites brighter, sorry, you'll see that information starts to appear in the black. Now everything that starts to appear on your now black canvas is absolute white. So you can see when I'm pushing this up, your histogram, the right hand end of your histogram particularly, is moving the most, with the other bits of it moving less so. And what you want to do really is just find the point at which there's like a speck of white is appearing in your picture, and that's where you want to leave it, so that you've got the tiniest amount that's just touching white or just before touching white, so the brightest parts of your image are made bright. And then we'll be doing the opposite for blacks. So if we grab our blacks, we hold the Alt key again, you'll see it turns white. And as I drag to the left to make our blacks darker, we'll start to see some information appear. And you can see here, if we went to -100, you can see how much black you'd be adding. If I let go of Alt, you can see what it looks like. Obviously, it looks terrible. And with blacks, I would suggest leaving your blacks at leaving slightly more black in than you were leaving white in. So in this case, I'm going to go to about -55, something like that. Is a good place to leave that. You can see it's really brought the depth down into the into his spots, for example, which is really, really nice. Again, as I said, if you need to make any changes as you go to things like exposure, if you feel like having pulled the blacks down that much, the exposure is slightly dark, you can adjust that. But I'm gonna change my highlights and shadows first. So now we've done whites and blacks, we're gonna go on to highlights and shadows. And as standard, you want to probably be pulling your highlights down, which flattens your image, flattens the highlights in your picture, and pull your shadows up, which flattens the shadows in your picture. And it just brings some more information into the midtones, and you'll see it all even out your histogram. It'll pull some of your information slightly closer together, which means you get usually like a cleaner gradient of tone throughout your picture. And it's good to do this because it will pull some detail back into your shot. And then if you decide you want to add more contrast, then you can do that afterwards. But I'd recommend flattening out your image and then adding contrast afterwards. So in this case, I've set them to -30 and +30 respectively, but I think I'm just going to bring shadows up a little bit more just to bring out a little bit more information. So we're going to go to +50 in the shadows. And I think our highlights were fine at -30. So that's where we're going to leave that for now. Next, we're going to go on to our clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. If you don't have dehaze, it'll be to do with, if you have CC, you're going to need to update your Photoshop or your Lightroom, whichever one you're working in, and you'll find dehaze will appear at the top of your adjustments, next, as it does here, next to clarity, vibrance, and saturation. If you have an older version of Lightroom or an older version of Photoshop, like CS6 or Lightroom 4, then you don't have access to dehaze, and that's fine. So just follow all the other steps without the dehaze slider, and you'll still get a very good result. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit of clarity. Now what clarity is micro contrast in your midtones. So it's basically taking tones in your picture that are already very similar and making them more different, essentially. It's making them more contrasty. So it's your midtones, where you've got pixels that are a very similar color, it separates the tonal difference between those pixels to give you what I guess your eye would see as more detail. It feels sharper because you're getting this slightly higher contrast in your midtones. It's something to be very careful with. It can be very effective for some images. In general, there are times where you can go up as high as +40, but for most of your photography, you're probably not going to want to go higher than 15, and often 10 is roughly where I'd cap out. In the case of this, because we had quite a foggy effect on our beginning image, it's quite successful at cutting through some of that haze. So I'm just going to leave it at about 13. I think that's good here. Next, we've got dehaze. So I'm just going to drag a little bit of dehaze just to go to, say, 15, just to pull some information into this. Again, cutting through that sort of haze that there was in the original file. After having done this, I'm just going to add a little bit more contrast. So that's underexposure up here. Just going to add some contrast to this. Just to go to 10 is fine. And it still feels slightly dark, so I'm just going to lift the exposure to -0.5 stop, which is roughly where I started. And then as you're at this point, you've added, most of the changes you're going to make to your tones in your picture here. Here is a good time to make any tweaks. Now you've got your nearly final image. So now we've pulled the exposure back up, and I feel it's probably about right. I think I'm just going to add a little bit more contrast into it, just again to really add to the punchiness of the difference in his fur. Just to go up to 15, I think that'll be fine. Now the final thing to do in this panel is our vibrance saturation. I'm just going to use vibrance here. I'm not going to touch saturation at all. I'm just going to go up to about 15. Now the difference here between the two is Saturation, when you drag your saturation up and down, it equally affects all of the colors in your picture. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It equally affects all the colors in your picture. Whereas vibrance recognizes which of your tones are more muted, and it will increase the saturation on those more than it will saturate the already saturated tones. So it's smarter than saturation is. So I would usually err on the side of using vibrance over saturation because it's a slightly smarter way of coloring your picture. Cool. So then let's go to our detail tab next. We're not going to use the tone curve on this one. That would be a different tutorial in of itself. Now, sharpening and noise reduction, which we've got here. For this image, we're not going to use any noise reduction because the image was shot at a low ISO. You can see here it's at 125. So there's not really any noise that we're going to have to get rid of. So we're not going to use any noise reduction. But sharpening, it's always worth adding some sharpening. As a general rule, sharpening is relative to your megapixel count of your camera. So the higher the megapixels you've got, the more sharpening you need to apply to get the same effect, essentially. So in this case, this is shot on a Nikon D3X, which is a 26 megapixel sensor. So as a general rule, I would suggest to people that shoot on a 24 megapixel sensor, because that's a very common sensor megapixel count, to go to between 75 and 80. So in this case, we're just going to go up to just above 80 because we've got a couple of megapixels higher. So let's just go to 85. That would be absolutely fine for this picture. Then we don't touch radius or detail because detail it's not the same as masking, but it has a similar-ish effect, and I feel that masking is more effective. Radius you can play with, but I've largely found that leaving radius at 1 leaves you with the most natural, effective results from this kind of sharpening. So I tend to leave my radius at 1. But masking, however, is really useful. So again, if we hold Alt, the same as we did for our black and white slider, we grab our masking slider, you'll see it turns white. And as we drag up, more of your image turns black, but bits of it still say white. The thing to remember with masking is that everything that is white is being affected by the change. So in this case, it's sharpening. So everything that's white is being sharpened. So if you leave your masking at 0, everything's being sharpened evenly. And if you have your masking at 100, you'll see that there are not huge amounts of your picture being sharpened. Now, it's important to find a middle ground. This is important because you don't want to be sharpening things like the sky or out of focus elements particularly. Because sharpening is used to draw the eye to areas of the picture that are most important, you need to mask your image to reflect that. So in this case, we're just going to drag this up until we're not sharpening any of the background. So we can go to about 65. You can see almost all of the leopard, lots of the tree are being sharpened, and they're all the areas that we're interested in having sharpened. So I think that is a good place to leave that. And the last thing we're going to do on this picture is lens corrections, which is something you should probably be doing on all of your photography. If you shoot on a Fuji camera, I believe lots of the Fuji models apply lens corrections in camera, so you won't need to do this. But pretty much every other camera manufacturer, you'll need to apply profile corrections here. So we just click Enable Profile Corrections, and it should automatically detect which lens you've got. In this case, it hasn't, so I just need to select that it was Nikon, and you'll see it's realized it was a 500mm. It for some reason wasn't picking up on the make. But as long as you know which lens you shot the picture on, you'll be able to apply the profile here. And I would, for an image like this, it may be worth removing chromatic aberration. Now, that's particularly obvious when a picture, like say a tree that's backlit by the sun, so the tree is in shadow and the sun is behind it, you get chromatic aberration there, which is where you get purple or pink and sometimes green fringing around each of the individual branches, which you'll really see when you zoom in. You'll get this sort of halo of color that looks really strange in your picture, and enabling chromatic aberration there can help. I'm doing the same here because it's largely backlit, and I've got these defined edges, so if there is any, this will have removed it, but I don't imagine there's very much in this picture. Now, the last thing you could do with this is using the HSL adjustments. I'm not going to do it here in Lightroom or Camera Raw, because I'm going to use color balance in Photoshop instead, but this would be a place where you can play around with adjusting the hues of your tones. So if you wanted to, make your leopard here more orange or more red or more towards green, for example, you can do that by playing with these tones here. But we're not going to be doing that here. So we're just going to leave those all at 0. Okay, so when we're done, we just need to make sure the image is selected, that we're going to move into Photoshop, and we're just going to click Open Image. And that will open it up for us in Photoshop. If we just give it a second. And there we go, we're opened up in Photoshop. So, what do we want to do when we're in Photoshop? The first thing we're going to do with almost every file you work on in here is to select our background layer and press Ctrl J or Command J on a Mac, and that will duplicate our background layer. And that just means that we're never going to be working on our background, we're going to be working on a duplicate, which just means we can protect it. It's always sensible to do, because if you need to make large undo changes to some drastic editing you've made, you've always got your background image that hasn't been affected. So it's really important to do that. The next thing we're going to do is go down here to our sort of half circle shape. You can also go to layer, new adjustment layer here, or you can just click on this icon down here and this will give you all your adjustment layers. Now in this tutorial, I'm just going to cover 2 of these. We're going to go through color balance and black and white. And that's black and white being used for contrast rather than being used to make your image actually black and white. You'll retain the color, but I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to go to color balance. This will open this up here. Yours might pop out the side. It depends how you've got your Photoshop configured, but in some way it will open up. So mine just opens up here. So I'm just going to drag this up a bit and drag this up a bit just to make my layers a bit bigger. Just because I like doing that. There we go. Okay. So what do I suggest we do? With this picture, it feels slightly yellow and still slightly green, and actually with a little bit of red. So that would be where I say the image is balanced at the moment. Under tone here, you've got shadows, midtones, and highlights. Your midtones are going to affect far more of the picture than the other 2 will, but we will go through all 3. So we're going to start with midtones. With the color balance tool, I would suggest that little is lots. So moving them by small amounts incrementally can make very big color changes to your picture. So I just would err on the side of smaller numbers rather than bigger numbers when you're making these changes. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I said it felt slightly green, so I'm just going to go slightly towards magenta. Let's go to about -5 to -4. It's about there. Yep, that looks like it's neutralized some of the green I was seeing. Then we're going to go up here to this where it feels slightly red. So I'm just going to take a little bit of the red out, not too much, just like -2 or -3. Just that will be fine. And here it feels ever so slightly yellow, but I don't necessarily dislike that because of the subject of the picture is that color anyway. So I'm just going to leave that one at 0. Next, I'm going to go into shadows and I'm going to add some blue into my shadows. Not very much, just let's go to about +5, +6, something like that. 6 feels a little bit heavy, so let's just go to +5. Yep, that looks good, and it just adds a little bit more contrast into our shadows. And then I'm going to go to our highlights, and I'm just going to do the opposite. I'm going to add some yellow into our highlights. So let's just go to -4, something like that feels good. If I toggle that on and off, you can see that's actually made quite a big difference to the color tone, and it's added some contrast. Now the contrast is coming from the highlights and shadow changes we made, and the color balance is largely coming from the mid-tone adjustments that we made. This is quite a cinematic way of adjusting colors. They like to use blues in the shadows and yellows in the highlights, or lots of cyany cool tones in the shadows with, reds and yellows in the highlights. You can be very specific with it, but it often results in quite a nice color palette that you've created. The next thing we're going to do is go again to open another adjustment layer. We're going to go to black and white. This is obviously going to make your image black and white. What I'd suggest doing is, if we just make our panel bigger here so we can see their colors here, I suggest that you drag these to create a black and white image that you sort of like. It doesn't have to be very accurate, but so the tones in your image are the right sort of tones that they should be. So in this case, I think yellow should be brighter because the yellow in the fur should be the bright part, and reds can be slightly darker, which is like the tree and lots of the darker patches of his fur, so that creates some nice contrast. Blues, there's going to be a tiny amount of blues. You can see it's in the background, so let's just bring that up just to neutralize that a little bit. Magentas, there aren't any. Greens, there's a small amount in the background again, so I'm just going to leave it relatively neutral so it doesn't add some funky effects to it. And cyans, there's a little bit, you can see the sun in the sky, so I'm just going to make it a little bit brighter just to neutralize it and make the background as simple as possible. So if I turn that off and on, it's quite a nice black and white picture. Now there's two things you can do here. One, you can use something like soft light to add contrast. Now obviously this is really overdone at the moment, but if I drag the opacity right down and just apply, say, between 15 and 25 is usually a good place to have it for an image like this, and you can see it really adds an extra level of punch to your picture, which is really nice. Well, the other thing you can do is set your blending mode to luminosity. If I turn that off and on, you can see it hasn't done very much. But what this really does now, if I were to adjust these, you can see how it affects the tone within those parts of your picture. So if I drag my yellows to be even brighter, you'll see how they're affected. You can see it's reducing and increasing the greens in the background. Okay, there wasn't too much blue, so that's not affecting very much. You can see how it brings that up and down. So I'd just say you can play around with the ways that you use these. So here I'm just going to leave it about there. And that is just, I think, has ended up with an exposure that I like slightly better, and the tones are being adjusted as they should be adjusted. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do with this picture today in terms of the adjustment layers. We've only got one thing left to do, and that's sharpen and then save the file. But if you want to play around with an image more, feel free. Please do experiment with using all of the different adjustment layers, see what they do to your picture. And yeah, that's the beauty of Photoshop. Playing around with it is a really good way of learning. So now we've got that there, that's all good. I'm going to use a very long shortcut, and the only way of doing this is through a shortcut. So on Windows, it's Control-Alt-Shift-E, and it will create what is called a clone stamp layer, which is a layer that has all the information below it consolidated onto one layer. And you need to do this last because we're going to be sharpening our picture, and we need to make sure that we're sharpening all the available, the actual usable pixels in the picture. I mean, if we sharpen one that has all the collated information, we know that the image is totally being sharpened. Now on a Mac, that is Command-Alt-Shift-E instead of Control. Okay, so now I've got our clone stamp layer. We just need to make sure it's selected. I'm going to go up here to Filter, Other, High Pass. I'll create this fun grey looking effect, and if I zoom in, you can really see what that's doing. I would suggest working off a radius of somewhere between 1.5 and 3 to 3.5 at the top end. And for an image like this, where the detail is relatively small in the picture, the leopard isn't taking up a huge amount of the picture, having a slightly lower radius makes more sense. So I'm going to use 2. I'm just going to go with about 2. I think that'll be fine. I hit OK, and obviously I've got this very funny looking layer. But all I have to do is change it to overlay or to soft light, depending on which effect I like more. So overlay is going to be a slightly stronger effect of sharpening, and soft light is going to be a slightly softer effect of sharpening. So just decide which one based upon your picture is going to work. If I turn that off and on, you can see how it really cuts through. So that's with it off. If I zoom right in, that's with it off, and that's with it on. So you can see it really brings out those details really nicely. Let me zoom out, and we're good. So I think that's about done for our edit. If you wanted to, because your black and white layer does take some contrast out of your picture, if you wanted to, you could add a vibrance layer in to sort of neutralize it and just bring some more color back up in the picture if you wanted to, if you feel like you've lost it. So you can do that there, and that's absolutely fine. So say this is where we wanted to leave it. We'll go to File, Save As, and then we're going to save our Photoshop document just by hitting Save with Photoshop selected. And if we want it as a JPEG for print, we've already set it for 300 DPI, so we know that that is right. We know that it's still Adobe RGB, and so we can call it, say, print as a version of that, and we'll just hit Save. And if you're printing, you want your quality to be maxed out, so I just set it to 12. Your format options would just be baseline standard, which is absolutely fine, and you hit OK. And that is all good, saved for print. And then if you're going to save for web, I suggest you go to File, Export, Save for Web Legacy. And what this will do is when it saves it, it automatically adjusts it to a 72 dpi file instead, and to an sRGB color space, which just means that the colors will be accurate for web, and you're not going to create a file that's too big, so it will load quickly on web pages. The only suggested change I make is going to JPEG here, setting this to very high, so your quality is at 80. It doesn't need to be all the way up 100, especially when it's going on the web. And then I would set your width to about 3000. For some platforms, you can go lower. So if it's going onto Instagram, you can cap it at 2000, because Instagram still uploads at about, I think it's about 17 to 1800 pixels on the max length. So you wouldn't be having much compression. But I usually export my web pictures at 3000 on whichever is the longest edge. So then I would just hit save, and it will resize it for me. And then we'll just call the same file web, and we hit save. It will save that, and we're all done. So thank you for watching today's video. If you've got any questions, please leave it in the comments, or do send me an email if I can help at all. I offer one-to-one photography, Lightroom, Capture One, Camera Raw, Bridge, all these kinds of things. Tuition, especially if you're based in London, so that's where I'm based. If you're interested in that, please do send me an email. And until next time, thank you very much.